Welcome to week 2 of our new series, 4 Questions for Better Decisions. You know, the 4 things that we ought to ask ourselves when we're up against a decision-making process, whether it's big or small decisions, if they're important, these are the 4 questions we ought to ask, but sometimes don't bother. And hence, we can fall into the traps that are before us and end up making the wrong decision. So 4 questions. Last week, Judith set us up by asking the very first and by far the most difficult and challenging of the 4 questions, and that is, am I being honest with myself? Really? It's a difficult question because it makes us delve deep and makes us ask other questions, not just these 4. But we're going to home in on the second question today, which goes very much hand in hand with that one, and it's this. What story do you want to tell? What story do you want to tell? May I just put up a little warning first before we delve into the thinking through this process of questioning, and that is that the content today has a fairly adult theme. It's drawn from the Bible, but it has a fairly adult theme. So if you've got young folks around, young children around, you may want to check out this message first before you make a decision about whether or not you want young folk to hear it. So we're going to ask this question of ourselves today. What story do you want to tell? But I want to pick up first on something Judith was talking about last week because it is so pertinent to the whole process of decision making, and that is this thing that our heart does when we are attracted to something that we want to make a decision around. It draws us in and makes us want something, and it becomes almost like an obsession. And then the brain gets to know about it and turns that want into a need. And that's the trap that we often fall into, because it may or may not be a real need. It may simply be an expression of a justification for a want. Now, the psychologists have a word for this. They call it focalism. Alternatively, the focusing illusion, which is that's an interesting concept in itself, isn't it? So it's the clues in the title. Focalism, that thing where our heart homes in on this want stuff and the brain turns it into a need. The focalism bit is where the thing becomes almost an obsession. Now, I know this deeply from personal experience because I'm a guitar player. Many of you know that if you know me. And us guitar players have a problem. It's called a guitar acquisition syndrome. It's called GAS. So you can never have too many guitars. But the problem is that you get into a state where you think you're needing another guitar and you have an identified model and you home in on that. And for an age, you are obsessing about it. It's the only thing you can think about. I want that guitar. And the brain turns that want into a need. So you're justifying, why would I want another guitar? And the brain tells you all sorts of lovely things. And in my case, it is desperately deceitful. It can say something dreadful like, but it's for the Lord's work. Therefore, it's terribly important and you need it. I mean, it's nonsense, but there you go. That's what the brain does. So this focalism is a dangerous thing. So when something has a very strong emotional appeal, that should be a red flag, not a green light. It's that pause for thought thing. It's that warning signal that, whoa, brother, you're going to have to think through this a bit more carefully before you commit to this. So focalism is a big deal for all human beings, always has been. That's what gets us into trouble. What story do you want to tell? That's a question that's going to be at the heart of all we look at today. And I'm going to draw on a story which is not short of 4,000 years old. And yet it is as fresh now as ever it was, because the story behind the story is of a human being, just like us. But this young lad that we're going to look at models what we're talking about today beautifully in an amazing way. Now, you may not know much about the Bible. It doesn't matter if you do. You may be very familiar with the story. But in any case, I'm sure that you probably know the story in its outline, because you may have seen Joseph and His Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, you know, the musical, the Lloyd Webber, Tim Rice thing decades ago. It was a fantastic musical, and it told the story really well. But we want to look at the real Joseph in the story today. And when this story set out, he was just a lad. He was only 17 years old when the start of this whole process began. So we're going to pick up some of the highlights of Joseph's life, but we're going to home in on one particular area where his decision-making process is what we want to model ourselves on. Now, you can read the whole story of Joseph in the very first book of the Bible, towards the end. It's Genesis, and it starts in chapter 36 and goes all the way to the end, chapter 50. We're going to pick up where things get more relevant to our talk today at about chapter 39. But early on, it tells you where, he was born to Jacob. He's got 11 brothers. And that was part of the problem. Joseph was a dreamer, you see. Joseph had this reputation as a young boy of being a dreamer. He had all sorts of amazing dreams, but he would interpret them, and he was always telling everybody what their dreams meant. Really upset his brothers. And his brothers felt really aggrieved at him. He was the favourite, you see. He was the favourite little boy. He was the youngest. And he was born to his dad's favourite wife. It's a different culture. So that's not a good setup. So Joseph's brothers didn't like him very much. And the story around his first demise was that the brothers got so jealous of him that they decided that they would have to bump him off. So they were going to take him out to the desert to knock him off. And the oldest brother, Reuben, said, no, we shouldn't do that. There's a band of Ishmaelite caravan thing. Let's sell him to them, and they can go and make a slave of him. At least we won't have his blood on our hands. So that's what they did. However, they took the coat back to their dad, having covered it in an animal's blood, and told Jacob, his dad, that he had been killed by a wild animal, but he'd been sold off as a slave. Now we pick up the story in chapter 39, where he is bought by an Egyptian person called Potiphar. Potiphar was a very important official in the Egyptian court. He was the captain of the guard. So Potiphar bought Joseph, and this is where we pick up the story. The Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered. And he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favour in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. Now, this is quite something. I mean, here he is, a 17-year-old lad. He's just been sold into slavery. But fortunately, he's been bought by someone who turns out to be a fairly honourable guy. Potiphar, the captain of the guard, a very important official, got to see this young man blossom. And the scripture describes it this way. It says that the Lord was with Joseph. And through that, Joseph succeeded. Now, that's an expression that probably indicates that God was really at the centre of Joseph's life. He was really important to him. He had a relationship with God that was a living relationship. And that spilled out in his character. It came out in the way he lived. And Potiphar was impressed by that. And so over time, he grew to trust this young man implicitly and passed on to him everything that he owned. And then something happened which kind of derailed things a bit for Joseph. And that's where we pick up the story. Now, Joseph was well built and handsome. And after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." Whoops. So, I mean, there he is, a young teenage guy. Well, he's maybe around 20 by this time. We don't know how long he was there, building up his relationship with Potiphar. And then suddenly Potiphar's wife starts to tempt Joseph and tries to seduce him. Now, can you imagine? Put yourself in that, guys, put yourself in that situation. Here you are, a young lad, and the boss's wife is hitting on you. What would go through your mind at that stage? Well, that's where we're at today, because the decision that Joseph makes at this point is critical. So let's go back to the story in verse 8. It says this, "But he refused. With me in charge," he told her, "my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even to be with her. Now, there's lots of things in there that shout loudly about the strength of Joseph's character, or they're not. There he is. He's the most powerful next to Potiphar in the whole of the household. And he looks at the whole situation differently. His heart may have been saying to him, "Oh, well, that would be a really good, nice thing." And his head says, "Whoa." So he asked himself, without any shadow of a doubt, what story do I want to tell? Because in not so many words, that's what his explanation tells us, does it not? He's saying to Potiphar's wife, "I'm in charge of all of this. Your husband has put me here. He doesn't keep anything back from me except you, because you're his wife." Now, he's therefore giving her the opportunity to recognize what she's up to, but she doesn't pay any attention to that. But Joseph says, "How can I therefore sin against God?" So he's got the bigger picture. He's looking at, what story do I want to be able to tell at the end of this? I have been given this wonderful position. Am I going to blow it by doing what you ask? So, a red flag. Now, as it turns out, it doesn't look like it was a good idea to do that, but then you work out for yourself what would have happened if he had done it. So he didn't do it, but then Potiphar's wife frames Joseph and said falsely that he did try to seduce her. And Potiphar has no alternative but to act on that information. And he puts Joseph in jail. Now, an interesting thing is he puts him in with the king's prisoners. Now, that's not quite the same kind of jail as all the other reprobates got. That it was a kind of, well, we don't know much about it, but it was the king's prisoners. So that was a kind of signal that he maybe wasn't that sure about his wife's story, because he kind of knew Joseph. Nevertheless, poor Joseph is in there. Now, he would probably have been dead if he had done what she had asked, but he was in the prison. And he was there for ages. And he met these two guys, a baker and a cupbearer, the king's cupbearer, Pharaoh's cupbearer. And over time, the people got to know him, and they knew that he could interpret dreams. And even the guard who looked after them, he found favour in his eyes as well. So Joseph's character was obviously a really strong and noble kind of guy. So these two people had dreams themselves and came to Joseph to say, "Would you please interpret them?" Now, the cupbearer's dream was a good one, and Joseph said, You'll be okay. You'll be going back to be Pharaoh's cupbearer again within a few days. And that's what happened. However, the baker didn't turn out so well, because Joseph said, I'm sorry to tell you, but you're just about to be executed. And that's what happened to the baker. So the cupbearer was really grateful and said, I'll make Pharaoh aware of you, and I'll tell him what you've done. So, however, he forgot about that, and it was 2 years before he remembered. And Pharaoh then came and asked him to interpret his dreams. So Joseph's fortunes looked really grim for that period. All that time, it got him in jail for no good reason. But his character remained unblemished. And eventually, when he interpreted Pharaoh's dream properly, that prevented disaster befalling Egypt. Because there were 7 years of famine coming, but there were 7 years of good before. So Joseph was put in charge of the whole of Egypt's resources, and he became effectively a prime minister. And he gathered stuff for 7 years so that when the famine came, Egypt was well stocked with food, so much so that they could sell it to other nations. So Joseph eventually rose to be a very, very powerful man. And at some point, his brothers, because they were suffering famine in Israel, came to ask for help in Egypt. Didn't know who Joseph was, but Joseph knew who they were. And it was a fairly lengthy little interchange there, and tricks going on and all sorts. But eventually, they found out who Joseph was and were absolutely grief-stricken by how they had treated him in the past and fearful of their lives. Joseph treated them well. So throughout the whole thing, you see, Joseph's character stood firm because he asked the right questions. He asked this particular question many times: what story do I want to tell? Well, Joseph's story is being told now, almost 4,000 years later, and it stands up as an amazing story of character. What story do you want to tell? What story do I want to tell? Unless we ask ourselves these 4 questions, and we'll come to the next two in the next 2 weeks, we will probably fall foul of the things that go on inside us that draw us into the traps. So we need to keep asking ourselves, am I being honest with myself and really true? And this next question, what story do I want to tell? It's our prayer that these questions will help you in your journey, as it will help us all in our journey in making the best decisions, so that the big picture that we don't know about, we don't know the outcome. In fact, we might never know some of the implications of what we do, but we do know that if we ask these 4 questions, we have a better chance of living lives that shine and have a good story at the end. We pray that you will have a blessed week, and that you'll come again next time to home in on the next of the 4 questions. In the meantime, bye-bye.